Dungeons are as essential to the Zelda series as milk is to cereal. From the inception of the series in 1986 to the present day, dungeons have served to create an exciting contrast with the world exploration above ground. Back when they were still called levels, the only way to differentiate one from another was the color palette and the room layout. The music was identical in each one aside from level 9, and the basic rules and principles also remained the same in each one. Due to the technical limitations of the NES, there weren't a whole lot of different options when it came to puzzles aside from pushing a block, defeating a specific enemy or all enemies in a room, bombing walls, an occasional hungry moblin that needed to be fed, or a flute concert to drive an enemy insane. Instead, it was the dungeon itself which served as the puzzle. Its layout demanded closely observing your map and figuring out how to get to the room containing the boss and the Triforce piece, all the while trying to survive the onslaught of enemies waiting for you in each room. With each new installment, we've seen dungeons evolve from simple grids to complicated multi-floor pieces of architecture with each their own unique look and feel. And this was taken to the next level when the series finally made its first leap into the third dimension. 3 dimensions meant that the layout of the room and areas was no longer straightforward. In the 2D games, it was very clear where the entrances or exits were, whereas in 3 dimensions, it's much easier to miss something because you're not presented all the information about the area you just walked in. Dungeons can be classified under certain subgroups based on its traits and its mechanics. If you've ever seen boss keys, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. Lock and key dungeons, gauntlets, puzzle boxes, etc. What this mostly boils down to is how you progress through a dungeon. Do I need to fight or puzzle my way from room to room while seldom being presented with branching paths? Or do I need to figure out how the dungeon works, backtrack, or generally get lost on my way to the final goal? And this is what I want to talk about in this episode: linear versus non-linear dungeon design. If you were to ask the Zelda community as a whole which dungeon is his or her favorite, you would be presented with a lot of different answers, and each with their own reasons for liking or disliking a specific one. Video game analysts like Mark Brown, King K, and Matthew Matoses generally lean more towards complex and non-linear dungeon design, which is understandable since these are people who are focused on and interested in game design and level design. But your average Zelda player might not agree with their assessment, since there is so much more to a dungeon than just its complexity. Atmosphere, for instance, which is much more of a subjective aspect, can sometimes make or break a certain dungeon for people. As an example, I've never really liked the Temple of Time in Twilight Princess, and this has nothing to do with the way it's structured, but more to do with my distaste for pristine and technological atmospheres. When it comes to dungeon crawling, I lean heavily towards the more classic, old rundown ruins and crypts and dark dungeons, deep dark caves and themes of horror and decay, which also explains why I like games like Silent Hill so much. Based on this info, I think you can make a pretty educated guess on what some of my favorite dungeons in the series are. The Forest Temple, Shadow Temple and Bottom of the Well, Snow Peak Ruins, Arbutus Grounds, and had I played more of Skyward Sword, I would probably prefer the Ancient Cistern, if only for this amazing underworld section. I won't deny that some of my favorite dungeons aren't necessarily the most challenging, especially in terms of navigation, but that's not what I play Zelda dungeons for. And although I like a good puzzle or challenging enemy, one of the most important things for me when entering a dungeon is, am I excited to be there? Do I feel a sense of wonder when I set foot into this massive structure? Now, the big difference between a linear and a non-linear dungeon is, of course, the way you navigate it and reach the boss room. In some dungeons, this room is hidden somewhere deep inside, far, far away from the entrance, and you have to soldier your way through to reach it. In others, this final goal is right there in the central room, and getting access to it requires branching out into many different directions and revisiting the same areas multiple times. Back in the old days of the NES, dungeons which were complex and required backtracking and crisscrossing through could be very confusing to navigate. Despite the absence of multiple floors, certain warp points could have you end up in completely different parts of the maze. And since all the rooms look alike, you often had to use rooms with certain traits such as a specific block pattern or other familiarities as anchor points to know where you have or haven't been. In order to streamline the dungeons in the 3D installments, the level designers incorporated the central room mechanic, a large space which branches out into different directions, giving the player something to hold on to while they explore its many rooms and hallways. In the cases of the Water Temple, Wind Temple and Snow Temple, just to name a few, this complexity is upped even further by including many different floors to choose from, making the dungeon feel even more maze-like. In order to overcome these challenges, you need to understand how rooms and floors interconnect and the relationship between different sections of the dungeon. This often requires crossing the central room multiple times as you slowly unlock the dungeon bit by bit. This also ties into the way the main dungeon item is incorporated into the progression. Up until the point of obtaining this item, large portions of the dungeon will be inaccessible and thus you are unable to get the full picture. In a way, this item functions as a skeleton key for the rest of the dungeon. In linear dungeon design, this central hub mechanic is obviously less necessary since the path is always going forward. The Shadow Temple is perhaps the most famous, or should I say infamous, for its straightforward progression. And while I love this dungeon to death for its theme, music and atmosphere, I do agree that in terms of navigation, the dungeon could have used some work. And by work, I don't mean make it more complex to navigate, since that would completely ruin the point of the dungeon. It's all about descending deeper and deeper down after all. But if you're going for a linear style of progression, at least do something original with it. Ironically enough, the Temple of Time, which as I stated before is one of my least favorite dungeons in Twilight Princess, does show how a linear dungeon can be done right in terms of its navigation. The path is still largely straightforward, but the catch is that you traverse the same path twice. Once on your own and then back the way you came with the giant statue, which also serves as the key to unlock the final stretch of the temple. Transferring the statue from room to room and figuring out how to get it into the correct positions makes for an interesting concept, and also establishes more of a relationship between the player and the dungeon itself. From the moment you walk in, you know that the goal is to somehow place a large statue onto the pedestal in the first room. The entire goal revolves around it, and after you finally arrive back at the start with the statue, the whole ordeal of getting it there feels satisfying. What's also interesting to note is that despite its straightforward navigation, it still manages to incorporate the main progression item into the linear design in a smart way, since you won't be able to control the statue without the Dominion Rod. Compare that to the Shadow Temple, which flat out gives you the main item at the very start of the dungeon since, well, where else are they gonna put it? There's barely any backtracking in the dungeon as it is. If you don't die on the way to Bongo Bongo, you will never visit these early sections ever again. All the dungeons and temples I've mentioned in these examples so far fall under a very clear category. The Water Temple is obviously non-linear. The Shadow Temple and Temple of Time are linear, etc. But the majority of dungeons actually fall more or less somewhere in between. There aren't many dungeons as complex as the Water Temple or as linear as the Shadow Temple. Some might look and feel rather complex on your first playthrough, but when you actually analyze the correct path you need to take, you quickly come to the conclusion that there's still a predetermined route you are allowed to take. The big difference being that whereas in linear dungeons you don't have to think about where you have to go next and are simply experiencing the dungeon on a room-to-room basis, in these hybrid dungeons, for lack of a better term, even though the path forward is set in stone and doesn't require non-linear exploration, you will sometimes have to backtrack or accidentally wander into the wrong direction for a while before getting stuck and having to turn back. These are basically semi-linear dungeons, sometimes disguised as a non-linear one. As an example, in certain dungeons you can hold multiple keys at once, and there are multiple doors to choose from, each of which takes you into a completely different section of the dungeon. In others you also may hold more than one key at the same time, but the doors with which to unlock them with are still presented in a predetermined order, giving the illusion of complexity. But actually you are still just following a set path. And then there's dungeons like the Snow Peak Ruins. A linear dungeon, but with the layout of a non-linear one. For instance, it has a central hub which you come back to many times. And as you can see from the map, it doesn't exactly look like a linear experience. Yet the progression is completely linear. Yeta tells you exactly where to go on your map and only unlocks doors for you one by one in a set order. There's literally no way to tackle this dungeon in any other order than the one laid out for you. Just like with the Temple of Time, this is an example of a linear dungeon but with a unique twist to it, which makes it far more interesting than just going from room to room in a straight line. Plus, you get to see Link get body slammed to the ground every time you come back to the main hub. I mean, what's not to like? There are examples of dungeons which make use of the same concept, but approach it in a way that each one feels different. The Forest Temple and Arbutus Grounds both feature the same mechanic, where you have to light 4 torches in the central room by defeating 4 Poe spirits who stole the flame away. But the similarities end with the way you reach this goal. In Arbutus Ground, each Poe can be dealt with out of order. Right off the bat, that presents you with 4 different directions to take. In the Forest Temple, this isn't possible. There are 2 ghosts that can technically be defeated in a different order, but these are both in the same general area and it doesn't change the way you go about finding your way forward. I think the most important thing to take from this video is that even though you might have a favorite dungeon from a specific game, it's much more important to look at dungeons in sets. A linear dungeon isn't by definition inferior to a non-linear one, given that it presents a different type of challenge, for instance through its combat or its micro-challenges like individual room puzzles. The reason why many people are of the opinion that Twilight Princess has some of the best dungeons in the series is because each one complements the other. The same thing goes for Skyward Sword. Even though I haven't finished the game myself, I do hear many voices around me expressing how unique each dungeon feels and stands out from one another. The Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild are the very definition of non-linearity, and I think the majority of players agree that they miss the traditional dungeons. But I have heard some people express that they actually preferred the Divine Beasts, and those people are no better than a Deku scrub. Just kidding, I love you all. But my take on this would be, why not both?
Both is good.
My problem with the Divine Beasts wasn't the way they were structured, but rather that this was the only dungeon variation we got. Had Breath of the Wild had a Divine Beast type of dungeon alongside completely different ones, it would have stood out and maybe even have been a fan favorite for many people. But by making all four look, play, and even generally sound the same, a lot of people felt underwhelmed. Imagine if besides the Divine Beast we had completely different dungeons with different types of progression. Some linear, some non-linear, and some in between. I have talked about this in my first video before. Breath of the Wild has mechanics that are completely new to the franchise. And a Divine Beast type of dungeon isn't the only way to make a brand new dungeon type that has the old school look and feel of previous games, but which have to be overcome in a completely new way. Linearity can be a great dungeon experience, so does non-linearity. The most important thing is presenting a solid set of dungeons which cater to different people. Give me that dark cave or crypt-like experience and give others that high-tech puzzle box, underwater maze, or ancient temple to explore. That way we're all happy, we each have our favorites, and it keeps the overall experience varied and surprising. And with that, I have said what I wanted to say. Let me know down in the comments what your favorite dungeon type is, linear or non-linear. Are you more into the dark, eerie Indiana Jones experience like me? Or are you more in favor of the technological Sheikah Shrine vibe or magical fantasy forest vibe? Be sure to let me know so I can shower you all with hearts. As always, a massive thanks to my gracious Patreon supporters who make these videos possible, one of which has just joined the cause, so say hello to Some Guy, as not to be confused with Some Guy. Thank you for all your support and everyone else for watching this video, which, believe it or not, also greatly helps. I hope you all have a great weekend and I will see you all next week. This is Don signing off and have a good one.